November 14, 1943, Berlin. Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, chief analyst for Foreign Armies West, sat in his cramped office reviewing after-action reports from coastal defense units. Before him lay documentation of 18 commando raids spanning 3 years, each meticulously analyzed, each revealing the same disturbing pattern. His hand moved mechanically across the page, underlining sentences, circling casualty figures, marking defensive failures with red ink that seemed to bleed accusation. The pattern was undeniable. Defensive measures that stopped one commando raid proved useless against the next. Searchlights installed after the Lofoten operation were bypassed during the Bruneval assault. Guard dog patrols implemented after Vogsoy failed to detect infiltrators at Saint-Nazaire. Increased sentry rotations, reinforced bunkers, improved communication systems. Each countermeasure worked once, perhaps twice, then became obsolete as the commandos adapted with speed that defied military bureaucracy's normal pace. Gehlen wrote a single sentence at the report's conclusion, knowing it would enrage his superiors but unable to suppress the truth. No defense works twice against the British commandos. They learn faster than we can adapt, innovate faster than we can respond, and evolve faster than our doctrine permits. He paused, staring at words that documented not merely tactical failures, but institutional inadequacy. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that treated warfare as experimental science, and losing. Traditional military doctrine assumed defensive improvements followed predictable evolution. An attacker developed new tactics. Defenders analyzed the attack, identified vulnerabilities, implemented countermeasures. The attacker, confronting improved defenses, required months or years to develop new approaches. This cycle allowed defenders time to adapt, refine, and eventually achieve advantage through accumulated defensive knowledge. The commandos violated this assumption completely. They treated each raid as both operation and laboratory experiment, testing defensive responses, identifying adaptation patterns, developing countermeasures to countermeasures before defenders could consolidate improvements. The cycle that should take years compressed into weeks. Defensive measures implemented at great cost became obsolete before their effectiveness could be properly assessed. The Lofoten Islands raid of March 1941 illustrated this dynamic. British forces struck Norwegian fish oil factories, critical to German explosive production, with conventional amphibious assault. Defenders, caught by surprise, offered minimal resistance. German after-action analysis was straightforward. Improve early warning systems, increase garrison strength, fortify landing beaches, position mobile reserves for rapid response. These measures were implemented across Norway's vulnerable coastline at substantial cost. Radar stations provided early warning. Infantry companies replaced undermanned platoons. Concrete bunkers covered landing beaches. Artillery units positioned to interdict approach routes. The defenses should have rendered subsequent raids impossible or catastrophically expensive. On December 27, 1941, the commandos struck Vogsoy and rendered every defensive improvement irrelevant. They approached during darkness, minimizing radar detection time. They landed under covering fire from Royal Navy destroyers, neutralizing beach defenses before infantry could respond. They brought specialized assault teams trained to reduce fortifications with concentrated firepower and explosives. They withdrew under smoke screens that prevented artillery from engaging effectively. The operation succeeded despite defenses specifically designed to prevent it. German casualties exceeded 150 killed or wounded. Norwegian resistance fighters, emboldened by the raid, provided intelligence on German dispositions. Most strategically damaging, the fish oil factories were destroyed, forcing Germany to develop synthetic alternatives at enormous cost. General Major Kurt Wojtasch, responsible for Norwegian coastal defense, wrote in baffled frustration, "The enemy studied our response to Lofoten, identified our defensive improvements, and developed specific countermeasures. They adapted faster than we could implement recommendations from our own analysis. We are defending against yesterday's tactics while they employ tomorrow's solutions. How does one defend against an enemy who learns from every encounter and implements lessons before we can consolidate improvements?" The question would haunt German defensive planning throughout the war and remain fundamentally unanswered. The Bruneval raid of February 27, 1942, demonstrated the commando's systematic approach to overcoming defenses. The target was a Würzburg radar installation on a clifftop, chosen specifically because its location seemed impregnable. The site was accessible only via narrow paths easily defended by small forces. Approaches were covered by machine gun positions. The cliff itself was considered natural fortification, too steep for practical assault. German planners had positioned the radar there, believing geography provided security that fortifications could not improve. The Commandos treated geography as problem requiring solution rather than insurmountable obstacle. They studied aerial photographs identifying climbing routes. They recruited mountaineers who trained assault teams in cliff climbing techniques. They conducted rehearsals on similar terrain in Scotland, refining approaches until execution became routine. They planned the operation with scientific precision. Timing correlated to tide and moonlight. Approach routes calculated to minimize exposure. Assault sequence choreographed to overwhelm defenders before response could organize. On operation night, they parachuted inland, avoiding coastal defenses entirely. They approached the radar site from the land side, reversing expected attack direction. They climbed portions of the cliff German planners deemed impassable, using techniques borrowed from Alpine warfare. They overwhelmed defenders in minutes, dismantled critical radar components, and withdrew to beaches where Royal Navy landing craft extracted them under covering fire. Total operation time 97 minutes. German casualties minimal. Strategic impact catastrophic. Britain gained access to German radar technology, enabling development of countermeasures that would degrade the Luftwaffe's defensive effectiveness for the remainder of the war. But the operational success was less significant than the methodological lesson. The Commandos had identified a target defenders believed secure, analyzed why defenders believed this, and systematically invalidated every assumption underlying that security assessment. They had not overcome defenses through superior force but through superior analysis, treating the defensive problem as intellectual challenge rather than merely physical obstacle. Oberst Heinrich Stever, commanding the sector containing Bruneval, submitted a report that read like confession. The enemy possesses analytical capabilities exceeding our own defensive planning competence. They identified vulnerabilities we did not recognize in positions we considered secure. They developed solutions to problems we did not realize existed. They executed operations we believed impossible. Recommendation: assume any position can be raided regardless of defensive measures, and plan accordingly. The recommendation was filed and ignored. High Command could not accept that German defensive planning was fundamentally inadequate. That admission would require rebuilding doctrine from foundations, an impossibility during active war. Easier to believe Bruneval was aberration, unlikely to repeat. The Commandos would prove otherwise at Saint-Nazaire, March 28, 1942. Saint-Nazaire, the operation that destroyed the Normandy dock, represented the apex of Commando adaptation and German defensive inadequacy. The dock was Germany's only Atlantic facility capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz. Its destruction would bottle the Tirpitz in Norwegian fjords, eliminating the threat to Atlantic convoys. The dock was protected by everything modern warfare could deploy: coastal artillery, anti-aircraft batteries, submarine nets, patrol boats, searchlights, extensive garrison forces, and security protocols refined through months of commando-driven paranoia. The defensive plan assumed conventional attack patterns. Naval assault would be detected miles offshore by radar and patrol craft. Approaches through the Loire estuary were covered by artillery positioned to destroy any attacking force. Even if attackers penetrated the estuary, they would face submarine nets, underwater obstacles, and overlapping fields of fire from shore batteries. The dock itself was protected by concrete, steel, and alert defenders. German planners calculated that destroying the dock would require sustained bombardment by heavy naval units, impossible given coastal artillery coverage, or ground assault by division-strength forces, impossible without securing the entire port. The Commandos used neither approach. They converted an obsolete destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, into a precision munition. The ship was modified to resemble a German vessel, loaded with delayed action explosives concealed in concrete chambers, and rammed into the dock gates at 17 knots. Commandos poured ashore fighting savage close-quarters combat, while demolition teams destroyed pumping stations and winding mechanisms. The operation accepted catastrophic casualties: 168 killed, 215 captured, to achieve objective considered worth any price. The delayed action explosives detonated 12 hours later, killing hundreds of German soldiers and technicians examining the wrecked destroyer. The dock gate, already rammed, now ceased to exist. The pumping systems that could have repaired the facility were destroyed. The Normandy dock remained inoperative for the war's duration. The Tirpitz never risked Atlantic operations. Kapitan Zerzee Karl Konrad Mecke, port commander, survived by chance. He had left the destroyer 5 minutes before detonation. His report documented not merely tactical defeat, but conceptual failure. We defended against conventional naval assault. The enemy converted the assault ship itself into the primary weapon. We prepared for bombardment or ground attack. They accepted catastrophic casualties to deliver explosives directly to the target. We assumed rational force preservation calculus. They demonstrated willingness to sacrifice entire units for strategic objectives. Our defenses were adequate against the attack we anticipated. They were useless against the attack that came. The report concluded, "No defense works twice against the British Commandos." Saint-Nazaire proves this definitively. The pattern Galen identified became impossible to deny. The Commandos operated through continuous innovation cycle that invalidated defensive improvements faster than German military bureaucracy could implement them. Each raid revealed new tactics, new equipment, new approaches that German defenders had not anticipated and could not immediately counter. By the time defensive improvements were analyzed, approved, resourced, and implemented, a process requiring months in Wehrmacht's hierarchical system, the Commandos had moved to entirely different methodologies. This innovation gap reflected fundamental differences in organizational culture. The Wehrmacht operated through centralized planning. Tactics were developed by staff officers, approved by high command, disseminated through formal doctrine, and implemented uniformly across all units. This system produced magnificent coordination at operational scale, but struggled with rapid adaptation. Changing tactics required convincing multiple levels of command, revising official doctrine, retraining units, processes measuring in months or years. The Commandos operated through decentralized experimentation. Individual units tested new approaches during training. Successful innovations were shared informally between units. Combined Operations Headquarters encouraged initiative rather than standardization. Tactics that worked were adopted immediately. Those that failed were discarded without bureaucratic resistance. The system privileged speed over uniformity, producing tactical diversity that defenders found impossible to predict or counter. Hauptmann Otto Braun, intelligence officer analyzing commando operations, identified this organizational asymmetry in a May 1942 report. The enemy treats warfare as experimental science. They conduct operations designed to test hypotheses about our defensive capabilities. They analyze results with scientific rigor. They implement lessons learned before we fully understand what occurred. Their organizational structure rewards innovation and punishes bureaucratic delay. Our structure rewards conformity and punishes deviation from doctrine. He provided specific examples. After Vogtsøy, Germans installed additional searchlights. The Commandos developed infrared sighting equipment invisible to defenders. After Bruneval, Germans increased patrols. The Commandos refined infiltration techniques, making patrols irrelevant. After Saint-Nazaire, Germans improved harbor defenses. The Commandos shifted to different targets entirely, refusing to attack where defenses had been strengthened. They adapt faster than we learn, Braun concluded. Each of our defensive improvements is analyzed, understood, and countered before it can demonstrate effectiveness. We are fighting an enemy who treats every engagement as a learning opportunity, while we treat engagements as validation of existing doctrine. Until we develop comparable innovation capacity, no defensive measure will remain effective long enough to justify its cost. The report was circulated to senior commanders, acknowledged as accurate, and filed without action. Wehrmacht doctrine could not be revolutionized during active war. The innovation gap would persist and widen. The Dieppe raid of August 19, 1942, illustrated both the Commandos' learning methodology and the limits of German defensive adaptation. The operation was the largest yet attempted. 6,000 men, predominantly Canadian infantry with commando support, assaulting a heavily defended port. German defenders, reinforced after months of smaller raids, had improved every defensive system. Artillery pre-registered on landing beaches, machine gun positions covering all approaches, obstacles and mines denying cover, mobile reserves positioned for rapid counterattack. The main assault failed catastrophically. Canadian forces suffered 3,623 casualties, killed wounded or captured. In 9 hours of brutal fighting, German defenses performed exactly as designed, validating every improvement implemented since Saint-Nazaire. Wehrmacht analysts celebrated Dieppe as proof that defensive doctrine, properly applied, could defeat even large-scale assault. Yet the flanking commando operations, attacking coastal batteries at Berneval and Varengeville, succeeded completely. Small teams achieved all objectives while the main force was slaughtered on Dieppe's beaches. This asymmetry was not accidental. The commandos had learned that frontal assault against prepared defenses was futile. Dieppe proved this definitively. But they had also learned that German defenses remained vulnerable to unconventional approaches. Infiltration, surprise, specialized training, and willingness to operate in small teams against objectives that doctrine said required company-strength forces. Oberst Horst Mendel, analyzing captured documents from Dieppe, identified the disturbing possibility. The main assault may have been intended to fail. Canadian forces tested our defenses while commandos accomplished actual objectives. If so, we are facing an enemy willing to sacrifice thousands of soldiers to gather intelligence for future operations. This suggests strategic patience beyond normal military planning. They are trading casualties today for knowledge that will inform invasion years hence. The analysis was dismissed as paranoid speculation, yet it proved accurate. Every lesson from Dieppe's failure would inform D-Day's success. Avoid frontal assault on defended ports, land on open beaches where defenses were thinner, use specialized armor to overcome obstacles, ensure overwhelming air superiority before committing ground forces, employ deception to prevent defensive concentration. The commandos had learned from failure as effectively as from success. Perhaps more so, since failure revealed defensive capabilities that successful raids never tested. They were conducting multi-year research program using human subjects, gathering data that would enable eventual invasion. German intelligence recognized this pattern but could not prevent it. Stopping the raids required resources unavailable. Allowing them to continue meant providing the commandos with ongoing education in German defensive methods, education they would eventually use to destroy those defenses entirely. By 1943, German defensive planning had devolved into futile exercise of implementing countermeasures the commandos would invalidate before they became operational. The cycle was predictable. Commandos raid using Tactic A, Germans analyze and develop countermeasure B, commandos switch to Tactic C before countermeasure B is fully implemented. Each iteration left German coastal units with defensive improvements addressing threats that no longer existed, while remaining vulnerable to threats they had not anticipated. The resource cost was staggering. Concrete poured into bunkers defending against approaches the commandos had abandoned. Steel fabricated into obstacles the commandos would bypass. Training time devoted to countering tactics the commandos no longer employed. Labor battalions building fortifications that would be obsolete before completion. Every defensive improvement represented investment that would never achieve return because the threat evolved faster than the defense. General Major Wilhelm Richter, responsible for coastal sector defense planning, articulated the problem in a brutally honest assessment. We are building defenses against yesterday's threats using tomorrow's resources. By the time any defensive improvement becomes operational, the enemy has moved to different approaches. We cannot defend effectively because we cannot predict what we are defending against. The enemy controls the innovation cycle. We merely react, always one step behind, consuming resources without achieving security. He provided specific examples. Guard dogs deployed after commando infiltrations proved effective, until the commandos began using scent masking techniques and approaches that avoided dog patrol routes. Electronic warning systems installed to detect beach landings worked well, until the commandos developed equipment that spoofed sensors or landed beyond sensor range. Reinforced garrisons improved defensive capability, until the commandos shifted to targets with lighter defenses or used larger assault forces. The fundamental problem is not tactical but methodological, Richter concluded. The enemy treats warfare as iterative process of hypothesis, experiment, analysis, and adaptation. We treat warfare as application of established doctrine. They learn from every operation. We learn slowly through formal after-action processes requiring months to translate battlefield experience into doctrinal changes. By the time we implement lessons learned, those lessons are obsolete. The assessment recommended radical reorganization, decentralized decision-making, rapid tactical adaptation, unit-level innovation, elimination of bureaucratic approval processes. The recommendations were acknowledged as theoretically sound, but practically impossible. Wehrmacht culture was built on centralized control and doctrinal uniformity. Revolutionizing organizational culture during active war would create chaos worse than the problem it addressed. The defensive inadequacy would persist. The Commandos would continue exploiting it. And no defense works twice would remain the defining characteristic of Germany's coastal war. The intelligence war paralleled the tactical struggle, with British capabilities consistently outpacing German countermeasures. Each commando raid was preceded by months of intelligence collection, aerial reconnaissance, resistance networks providing ground-level detail, escaped prisoners offering descriptions of defensive layouts, signals intelligence monitoring German communications. This intelligence was synthesized into assault plans with precision exceeding German operational planning standards. German counterintelligence struggled to penetrate this intelligence apparatus. The Abwehr attempted to plant double agents within resistance networks, but British security services identified and turned most German agents. Attempts to locate commando training facilities through signals intelligence failed because the British employed sophisticated communications security. Efforts to predict raid targets based on reconnaissance patterns proved futile because the Commandos conducted reconnaissance on dozens of sites for everyone actually raided. Most frustrating was the one-way nature of intelligence flow. The Commandos learned continuously from each operation, captured documents, interrogated prisoners, observation of defensive responses. German defenders learned only what the Commandos chose to reveal through their tactical approaches. It was asymmetric education, one side systematically expanding knowledge while the other received fragmentary, often misleading information. Oberst Friedrich Adolf Krummacher, Chief of Intelligence for Armed Forces High Command, wrote in December 1943, "The enemy possesses comprehensive intelligence on our defensive dispositions while we possess minimal intelligence on their capabilities, training, and intentions. They study us scientifically. We speculate about them desperately. Every raid provides them data, while providing us only confusion. They know our weaknesses better than we know our strengths." He detailed the intelligence asymmetry's operational impact. British planners knew which coastal sectors were heavily defended and which were thinly held, allowing them to concentrate forces at weak points. They understood German reinforcement timelines, enabling them to accomplish objectives and withdraw before reserves could respond. They had access to German communication procedures, occasionally impersonating German units to create confusion during raids. Meanwhile, German intelligence relied on speculation and captured documents of uncertain authenticity. Estimates of commando strength varied wildly, from 5,000 to 50,000 personnel. Understanding of training methods was fragmentary. Knowledge of equipment and specialized capabilities came primarily from captured gear, analyzed months or years after initial deployment. Prediction of raid targets was essentially random, sometimes correct by chance but never through systematic analysis. "We are fighting blind against an enemy with perfect vision," Krummacher concluded. "No defense works twice against the British Commandos, partly because they learn from every encounter, while we remain ignorant of how they will adapt. Until we achieve intelligence parity, defensive improvements will remain reactive, inadequate, and perpetually obsolete. The intelligence gap, like the innovation gap, would never close. The human cost of continuous adaptation fell heavily on German coastal units. Soldiers stationed in defensive positions understood through painful experience that their fortifications and protocols provided only temporary security. The bunker that seemed impregnable today might prove vulnerable tomorrow through some commando innovation they could not anticipate. The defensive measure that worked last month might be obsolete this month." Every soldier knew. The Commandos were studying them, learning their patterns, identifying their vulnerabilities, and would eventually return with solutions to defenses that seemed adequate. This knowledge created pervasive psychological degradation. Lieutenant Hans Weber, stationed in Normandy, kept a diary documenting the erosion. March 1943. New minefield installed. Feel more secure. April 1943. Heard Commandos used mine-clearing equipment at recent raid. Feel less secure. May 1943. Additional guard posts established. Feel marginally better. June 1943. Learned Commandos infiltrated past similar guard configuration elsewhere. Feel worse than before. July 1943. cannot sleep imagining how they will defeat our defenses when they come. Medical officers reported increasing psychological casualties among coastal troops. The symptoms resembled combat fatigue, hypervigilance, sleep disruption, anxiety disorders, despite many soldiers never having experienced actual combat. They were being worn down not by fighting, but by anticipation of fighting against an enemy who seemed always one step ahead. Hauptmann Dr. Ernst Vogel, analyzing these cases, wrote, "The soldiers suffer from rational fear of inadequate defenses rather than irrational panic. They understand that defensive improvements are temporary, that the enemy will develop countermeasures, that when attack comes their fortifications may prove useless. This knowledge, that they are defending with obsolescent methods against continuously evolving threats, produces psychological attrition worse than combat itself. The Wehrmacht's traditional response to morale problems, discipline, punishment, appeals to duty, proved inadequate. The soldiers were not shirking or cowardly. They were professional enough to recognize when their defenses were structurally inadequate, when their commanders lacked solutions to tactical problems, when their prospects in coming combat were poor. Telling them to trust in their fortifications when those fortifications had repeatedly proven vulnerable only deepened demoralization. Some units developed fatalistic attitudes. They would do their duty, man their positions, follow protocols, but they harbored no illusions about surviving commando assault. Others adopted defensive nihilism. If no defense worked twice, why invest effort in defensive improvements? Better to accept vulnerability than waste energy on measures that would prove temporary. Oberst Werner Schmidt, investigating morale collapse in several coastal units, concluded, "We are asking soldiers to defend confidently using methods they know are inadequate. This is psychologically impossible. Until we can demonstrate defensive effectiveness that persists across multiple engagements, our coastal forces will remain demoralized regardless of fortifications built or doctrines implemented." By early 1944, German defensive planning faced complete paralysis. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. The commandos would continue adapting faster than defenses could evolve. Every recommendation for improvement was met with justified skepticism. Would these improvements remain effective long enough to justify their cost? The institutional knowledge that no defense works twice had become self-fulfilling prophecy. Defensive measures were implemented half-heartedly. Soldiers manned positions without confidence. Commanders planned without expecting success. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, appointed to inspect Atlantic defenses in late 1943, recognized the crisis immediately. He spent weeks examining fortifications, interviewing commanders, reviewing intelligence assessments. His conclusion, delivered to Hitler in January 1944, acknowledged fundamental inadequacy. The Atlantic Wall is propaganda fiction rather than military reality. We have built static defenses against an enemy who specializes in defeating static defenses. We have implemented uniform measures against an enemy who excels at non-uniform approaches. We have created predictable obstacles against an enemy whose defining characteristic is unpredictability. Rommel recommended complete strategic reorganization, abandon reliance on coastal fortifications, create powerful mobile reserves capable of rapid counterattack, accept that initial invasion landings would succeed, but ensure they could not break out from beachheads. This approach acknowledged that preventing invasion was impossible. The commandos had proven that any beach could be successfully assaulted given proper preparation. The only viable defense was to contain and destroy invasion forces after landing, but before they could establish operational momentum. The recommendation was partially implemented. Rommel received authority to strengthen Atlantic defenses with additional obstacles, mines, and fortifications. But he was denied the mobile panzer reserves essential to his strategy. Those divisions remained under central control, positioned inland, unable to respond rapidly to invasion. The defensive improvements he implemented were exactly what the commandos had trained to overcome: static obstacles vulnerable to specialized equipment, fortifications with predictable fields of fire, mines detectable through established procedures. As D-Day approached, German coastal commanders understood they were defending with inadequate means against an enemy who had spent 4 years learning to defeat exactly these defenses. Intelligence reports from spring 1944 indicated imminent invasion, but defensive preparations remained incomplete, contradictory, and fundamentally inadequate. The commandos had educated themselves on German defensive methods, while simultaneously educating German defenders on the futility of static defense. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, commanding the sector where British forces would land, wrote in his diary on June 1, 1944, "We have prepared as well as circumstances permit. Yet I know our defenses will not work, not because we lack courage or competence, but because we are defending with yesterday's methods against tomorrow's innovations. When they come, they will have solutions to problems we did not realize existed. We will learn once again that no defense works twice against the British Commandos." June 6, 1944. The innovations began at 0016 hours, when British Pathfinder teams landed via parachute and glider, seizing objectives using tactics refined through years of commando operations. At Pegasus Bridge, Major John Howard's glider-borne troops captured the bridge in 10 minutes using techniques developed specifically to overcome defensive improvements implemented after previous raids. The defenders had prepared for conventional assault, infantry advancing under covering fire. They faced unconventional approach, transport gliders landing within meters of objectives, troops emerging with weapons ready, violence so sudden that resistance collapsed before it could organize. At Merville Battery, Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway led 150 paratroopers against fortifications designed to be impregnable. German engineers had studied commando assault methods, building defenses specifically to counter them. Reinforced concrete, interlocking fields of fire, extensive minefields, barbed wire obstacles. The defenses should have required battalion-strength forces to overcome. Otway attacked with what he had, 150 men, many separated during drops, missing most heavy equipment, and succeeded through innovations German defenders had not anticipated. Crawling through minefields, accepting casualties, cutting wire with hands bloodied by steel and shrapnel, assaulting bunkers with grenades and bayonets at point-blank range. 50% casualties in 20 minutes. The battery silenced. Landing craft approaching Sword Beach unmolested by artillery that should have destroyed them. Along the invasion beaches, specialized units employed equipment and tactics developed through 4 years of raids. Swimming tanks overcoming beach obstacles, engineers clearing mines using methods refined at Dieppe, infantry advancing under covering fire coordinated with naval bombardment through communications procedures tested during smaller operations. Every technique had been developed, tested, refined, and perfected through the continuous innovation cycle that German defenses could never match. Oberst Friedrich Krug, arriving with reserves at 0600 hours, found his defensive sector penetrated at multiple points by forces employing tactics his troops had not trained to counter. "They used equipment we did not know existed," he reported. "They approached from directions we had not fortified. They employed techniques that invalidated our defensive preparations. Everything we had learned from previous commando raids proved inadequate because they had learned faster and adapted more completely." His report concluded with acknowledgement of comprehensive failure. No defense works twice against the British Commandos. This principle, which we identified years ago but could never overcome, has now been demonstrated at strategic scale. They studied our defenses for 4 years, developed solutions to every obstacle, and implemented those solutions with precision that exceeded our capacity to respond. We were defending against the enemy we knew. They became the enemy we could not anticipate. The subsequent weeks revealed the cumulative impact of 4 years spent in unwinnable innovation race. German counterattacks came piecemeal, using tactics the Allies had studied and prepared to defeat. Panzer reserves, which might have destroyed the beachhead if committed immediately, arrived exhausted after forced marches under air superiority the Allies had established specifically to prevent rapid reinforcement. Defensive positions that should have contained the invasion were bypassed or reduced, using techniques the Commandos had pioneered during smaller raids. Captured German officers, interrogated during the Normandy campaign, consistently acknowledged that their defenses had been systematically rendered obsolete before invasion began. They described watching Allied forces employ solutions to defensive problems German planners had considered insurmountable. They explained how every defensive improvement they had implemented had been anticipated, analyzed, and countered through equipment or tactics they had never encountered. General Major Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote in his memoirs, "The Commandos had conducted a 4-year course of education, for themselves and for us. They learned how we defended. We learned that our defenses were inadequate. They implemented lessons continuously. We implemented lessons slowly, always trailing their innovation. By D-Day, they possessed comprehensive understanding of our methods, while we possessed only fragmentary knowledge of theirs. The invasion succeeded not through numerical superiority alone, but through intellectual superiority developed across hundreds of raids. The bitterness in captured officers' assessments reflected professional recognition that they had been outthought, rather than merely outfought. Major Klaus Hartmann, captured at Caen, stated bluntly, "We were good soldiers. They were better learners. We fought according to doctrine developed before the war. They developed new doctrine every month, learning from each operation, adapting faster than we could respond. By the time we understood how they had defeated our defenses, they had moved to new methods that rendered our understanding obsolete." Oberst Ernst Goth elaborated, "The principle that no defense works twice against the British Commandos reflected fundamental organizational asymmetry. Their system rewarded innovation and punished stagnation. Our system rewarded conformity and punished deviation. They could adapt in weeks. We required months. This gap, measured in innovation speed rather than firepower or numbers, determined the war's outcome more surely than any battle. They learned faster than we could teach ourselves, and in modern warfare, learning speed is force multiplier more powerful than tanks or aircraft. The captured German intelligence briefs documented this reality with painful precision. Continuous innovation against static defense, adaptation against rigidity, learning against doctrine. The Commandos had not merely defeated German coastal defenses, they had rendered the entire concept of static defense obsolete. August 25, 1944. Paris, liberated. The Wehrmacht withdrew from France in disorder, abandoning defensive positions built at enormous cost, leaving behind soldiers who had spent years manning fortifications that proved strategically worthless. The Atlantic Wall, conceived as impregnable barrier, built through massive resource investment, had failed not through being overcome, but through being rendered irrelevant. The Commandos had taught the Allies how to defeat static defenses. D-Day demonstrated those lessons at continental scale. In prisoner-of-war camps across England, captured German officers processed their defeat through lens of professional analysis. Many maintained dignity, but private writings revealed profound reckoning with institutional failure. They had been part of military machine that conquered most of Europe in 2 years, yet they had been systematically defeated by enemy, who treated warfare as evolutionary process. Continuous innovation, relentless adaptation, learning faster than opponents could respond. Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, whose intelligence brief had identified the pattern years earlier, was captured in May 1945. His final assessment, written for American intelligence, provided epitaph for German coastal defense. "We recognized the problem early. No defense works twice against the British Commandos. We documented this pattern extensively. We understood its implications. Yet we could not overcome it because our organizational structure prevented adaptation at the speed required. They innovated faster than we could learn, adapted faster than we could respond, evolved faster than our doctrine permitted. This was not tactical failure, but institutional inadequacy." He elaborated on the strategic implications. Modern warfare includes temporal dimension beyond traditional military analysis. Victory belongs not merely to forces with superior numbers or technology, but to organizations that learn fastest. The Commandos created organizational system optimized for continuous learning. We maintained organizational system optimized for doctrinal consistency. In static warfare, consistency provides advantage. In dynamic warfare requiring constant adaptation, consistency becomes fatal weakness. His conclusion addressed future military organizations. The lesson is simple but profound. No defense remains effective indefinitely against enemies who treat warfare as experimental science. Defenders must innovate as rapidly as attackers, or accept inevitable defeat. Static doctrine, however perfect initially, becomes obsolete through enemy adaptation. Military organizations must build institutional capacity for continuous learning, rapid innovation, and cultural acceptance that today's solutions will be inadequate tomorrow. The British Commandos understood this. We did not. That difference determined the war's outcome more surely than any battle or campaign. The German intelligence briefs had stated the truth. No defense works twice against the British Commandos, because they never attacked the same way twice. The British Commandos were disbanded in 1946. Their mission accomplished, their methodologies institutionalized throughout modern military doctrine. The men returned to civilian lives carrying knowledge that they had participated in something unprecedented, military experimentation that revolutionized warfare's fundamental dynamics. They had proven that continuous innovation trumps static defense, that organizational learning speed matters more than initial capability, that evolutionary approach to tactics defeats doctrinal rigidity. The German officers who survived returned to divided, occupied nation, whose military traditions had been discredited by the regime they served. Yet their professional writings, published decades later, acknowledged the Commandos' achievement with remarkable candor. These were not bitter rationalizations but honest assessments from soldiers who recognized they had encountered enemy operating according to principles their own doctrine could not accommodate. The legacy endures in every modern special operations force. Emphasis on continuous training, rapid tactical adaptation, decentralized decision-making, organizational culture that rewards innovation over conformity. The techniques the Commandos pioneered: treat every operation as learning opportunity, analyze results rigorously, implement lessons immediately, never repeat failed approaches, continuously evolve tactics to stay ahead of defensive adaptations, now constitute standard doctrine worldwide. Most fundamentally, they validated principle that would reshape military thought. In modern warfare, learning speed is strategic weapon. The side that adapts faster wins, regardless of initial advantage in numbers or technology. Static defenses, however formidable initially, become obsolete through enemy innovation. Organizations that cannot evolve at the pace of threat development will be defeated by organizations that can. 70 years later, military historians still analyze the Commando campaigns as case studies in organizational learning and continuous innovation. The principle that no defense works twice has become axiomatic in special operations doctrine, not because defenses are inherently weak, but because competent attackers study defensive responses, develop countermeasures, and evolve faster than defenders can adapt. The German intelligence briefs documented this reality with clinical precision. They recognized the pattern, understood its implications, acknowledged their inability to overcome it. They were defeated not through lack of courage or competence but through organizational structures that prioritized doctrinal consistency over adaptive innovation. The Commandos had discovered warfare's fundamental truth. In conflict between evolution and stagnation, evolution always wins. They adapted continuously, learned relentlessly, and innovated faster than their enemies could respond. They proved that small forces properly organized for continuous learning could defeat larger forces trapped in doctrinal rigidity. The war was won not by those who built the strongest defenses, but by those who learned fastest how to overcome them.